Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast, and welcome to a new series that is all about sleep in infants, in kids, in teenagers, and in parents. Now, this series is going to be a little different than normal. Normally, as well you know, it's just me. But for this topic series, I've brought in and interviewed Dr. Craig Canapari, who is one of the world leaders in pediatric sleep medicine. And he is a pediatrician at Yale New Haven Children's Hospital, and there he specializes in the care of children with breathing disorders and sleep-related problems. By the way, Dr. Canapari, Craig, he's a good friend, Craig has also written a fantastic book on sleep for babies, sleep for kids, and parents. It is called It's Never Too Late to Sleep Train. It is so well written, and it's not a long book. You can read it in a day or less. So have a look at the book. As I said, it's called It's Never Too Late to Sleep Train. So please enjoy this first episode in a new series all about sleep, infants, teenagers, kids, and advice for parents. Craig, it is a distinct pleasure and an absolute delight to have you on the show. And alongside for this series regarding sleep, infancy, infants, childhood, teens, thank you so much for doing this. It is certainly not my area of expertise. I knew I had to have someone to guide us through a journey on this topic. I get asked about this topic so much, and I just never felt robust in terms of my own clinical, scientific, even personal experience. And you have all three of these. And there was just one person who has done such amazing work from a public health communication clinical standpoint in these areas. There was only one person that I desperately wanted to interview. So you were it. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Craig. So as I mentioned, this will be a 4-part series. We're going to speak about 3 stages, I think, of human development: infancy, I will speak about childhood, and then we'll speak about the teenage years. And the first 2 episodes, we're going to speak about sleep in infants. And I'd just like to dive right in, but perhaps at a high level, because what we certainly know is that during our human lifespan, or indeed, if you actually look at the lifespan of any other species, we see the most dramatic, the most extraordinary and staggering changes in the need for sleep and the different stages of sleep and how they change during this period that is infancy. And maybe you can define for us, firstly, how you think about what that time period of quote unquote infancy actually is from your practice. And then upon that definition, maybe we could start with the big picture detail also of how much sleep should babies be getting, and maybe even give some broad brushstrokes relative to children and teens. So help me understand the time frame over which you define infancy, and then maybe a little bit about the general thoughts regarding age and total amount of sleep need.
Absolutely. One of the great pleasures of working with babies and kids is just seeing how quickly they grow and develop, and it's really remarkable. The first year of life encompasses infancy, broadly from birth through the first birthday. A lot of authors will also tease out the first 3 months of life and say that that's the newborn period. In general, the theme that we see throughout childhood is an overall reduction in sleep duration and longer periods of wakefulness. So in the first year of life, these transitions happen so quickly that many parents' heads spin. And it is one of those things that you find as a parent, you kind of figure something out in the first couple of months and then it changes. So based on the National Sleep Foundation published recommendations for sleep duration, They say that the normal amount of sleep in a 24-hour period is between 14 and 17 hours in the newborn period. I'm going to say also that they did stipulate that up to 2 hours more or 2 hours less could be within the normal range, but it's less common. So you could have a healthy child who is sleeping 12 hours in a 24-hour period in infancy, and I guarantee they are not doing that in a row. Newborns are also going to tend to nap every 1 to 2 hours, and they really haven't evolved that sort of circadian rhythmicity yet. What drives the timing of infant sleep is essentially feeding. And there's a rhythm of wake, cry, feed, sleep. That are like 1 to 2 hour cycles when a baby is born. In the infant period, that 24-hour sleep duration goes down to 12 to 15 hours, but again, it can be a little bit wider than that and still be normal. Most infants from 4 to 11 months of age, at first they're going to be taking 3 naps per day. Then typically sometime between ages 6 months of age and 15 months of age, they're going to go down to 2 naps. And this is one of those reasons I think we're going to talk about later about why naps can be so challenging for people, because the ranges of when these nap transitions from, say, 4 naps to 3 naps to 2 naps, et cetera, is very wide and varies quite a bit from child to child. So for parents who are maybe reading something in a book or talking to their friends, it can be hard for them to get a feel for when their kid should be napping because it's so variable.
That's really interesting. I think so. In that first 3 months, what we would classify that sleep as being highly polyphasic, where as adults, for the most part, we're monophasic, where we have this one long bout of sleep at night and then we're awake for maybe 16 hours, some more than that. Infants, not at all like that. They're awake, they're asleep, they're awake, they're asleep, they're awake, they're asleep. And in the first 3 months, it almost doesn't matter, what time it is on the clock face. That cycle of every 1 to 2 hours of sleeping, aka napping, short naps, just repeats. And that is the torture for the parents, of course. And that's driven by the caloric needs because it's very difficult for the infants to consume enough calories, is my understanding, to sustain them for a period of sleep that's much longer than that. So they're up and they're down, and they're up and they're down, and then things start to stabilize in the sense that within the individual from 4 to 12 months, things are no longer as erratic. However, that's within that individual, is what you're saying. What you also mentioned that was so elegant, and perhaps why parents look at each other and think, what? The variability from one child to the next, not within a child from one night to the next or day to the next, from one child to the next is very variable too. And so that's part of the confusion. And it's why it's so hard to sort of say, this is what's going to happen from month 4 to 12 for your infant. Is that sort of right in terms of the unfortunate message for parents?
Well, I think what we do know is fairly consistent is where someone's going to fall on that sleep distribution. So kids
Mm.
that tend to sleep in the longer end of things, say a newborn who sleeps 17 or 18 hours a day in a 24-hour period. I mean, a couple of observations. First of all, those parents are going to be the parents, they're the envy of the daycare or the preschool, right? These kids seem to sleep well no matter what. The parents don't struggle. They have this, for whatever reason, I'm more of a sleep requirement than their peers. I was one of these kids and I used to sleep 20 hours a day. And my mom was at the pediatrician's all the time saying that there was something wrong with me, which of course I don't recall, but has been told to me in colorful detail by my father on many occasions. The flip side is the kids who are on the lower end of the spectrum, these are the parents who tend to really struggle. And this is kind of a theme throughout childhood. Once they get to adolescence, however, these kids tend to have an easier time because they can deal with some of the issues we're going to talk about later, the sleep curtailment that is so common in adolescence. But in infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, these parents can really struggle. And if you look at the distribution of these, there have been lots of people who have looked at this, but there was a study that was published, I think in 2003 by Iglostein, and it was surveying about 460 Swiss infants and toddlers. And you can see just the width of the range of normal sleep in these children, and it narrows fairly quickly in the first year. But where kids fall on that chart, they tend to stay on that chart.
A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a service, and they come to your home, as they do for me, and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is happening inside of you regarding a host of different blood and metabolic and hormonal health metrics. What I also like is that in addition to the results, they then provide you with a personalized set of recommended, I guess, sort of lifestyle changes and suggestions to better optimize your health as a consequence of what those results were for you, that unique snowflake. So you can use the link insidetracker.com/Matt Walker, and you will get a healthy discount from your purchase. So again, that is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Interesting. And do you think that fits with what I've spoken previously about chronotype, and that there is a strong proportion of whether you're morning type, evening type, or somewhere in between that is genetically determined? Up to 9 genes was the last count. And we also know that there's some genetic influence regarding your sleep need and even the different stages of sleep. Does that resonate with you then, Craig, and this sort of observation that you've been seeing that child, it almost feels as though it's genetically hardwired, and that at least can be not taken to the bank necessarily, but that established rhythm of sleep that you've just described is probably going to be maintained for the child, and thus the parent has some degree of expectation.
Yeah, and you're definitely going to see the emergence of this. I would say typically in later infancy, in the back end of the first year of life. Almost all kids before puberty are relative to their parents morning types, but there's a big range, right?
Right.
There's a big difference from a parent standpoint, a child that wakes up at 4:30 in the morning and a child that wakes up at 6:30 in the morning. Often for parents, especially young parents, it all feels pretty early. And, those are kind of I'd say the extremes of the range of when kids get up. 4:30 or 5 is really painful for parents. I'd say more typically, it's in the 5:30 to 6:30 range. And occasionally you'll see some kids, a quote unquote evening type in early childhood is probably a kid that's going to naturally sleep till 7 in the morning.
Okay. So at this stage, we've got even a subtle distinction for infants where we've got newborns, sort of 0 to 3 months, sleeping between 14 to 17 hours. And that sleep is coming essentially every 1 to 2 hours. They're up, they're down, they're up, they're down. And then from month 4 to 12, things start to stabilize. Maybe a circadian rhythm starts to get glued into place in the brain. And at that point, even though sleep amount decreases from, let's say, 14 to 17 down to 12 to 15, what also happens is some degree of consolidation of a sleep rhythm where it's 2 to 3 naps during the day and then longer bouts of sleep at night. Is that the expectation menu that parents could at least take on board, understanding there's going to be variability even within their children?
Absolutely. And people really struggle with this. In the first couple of weeks, it's all about the feeding schedule. And then at 2 to 6 weeks of life, you're going to start to see the emergence of a longer sleep period during the night. Prior to that, there can actually be a period where a child will have their longer sleep period during the day, which is obviously difficult for parents. I do think getting light exposure for the baby can kind of help the baby entrain. We're seeing some of the emergence of a circadian rhythm here. 8 to 12 weeks. And again, these vary from baby to baby, but you're going to see some shortening of the daytime sleep and some more wakefulness. This is also going to be when you're going to see some more emergence of a social smile. Baby's personalities start to come out a little bit more. This really continues 12 to 16 weeks in the 4th month. You're going to see less need for frequent feeding at night and longer sleep periods, though most kids are still going to need several feedings during the night. And I know that you talked a lot in your book about sleep architecture, and I would wager that people who are listening to this podcast have some familiarity with this. So it's very interesting also the architecture of sleep in babies. And when we say architecture, we're looking at measuring the brain waves of these babies. So when you or I enter sleep through non-REM sleep, and we'll cycle into deep sleep and then start having more of their REM sleep later on during the night. Babies actually enter sleep via REM sleep, which is also called active sleep in the sort of taxonomy of how the EEG or electroencephalogram is scored in infants. It's about 50% of the night in newborns, whereas for adults, it's 20% of the night. And kids start the night in dream sleep. In an adult, if we saw that, we'd be worried that they had narcolepsy.
Narcolepsy, yeah.
We also know that a feature of REM or rapid eye movement sleep, as well as the eponymous eye movements, is paralysis, right? Of all of the muscles in your body except for your diaphragm and your eye muscles. Well, in newborns, there's actually incomplete paralysis of descending paralysis. So babies in REM or active sleep will move, pause, grunt, etc. It's very common for parents to call their pediatrician, be like, my kid is having pauses, he's grunting when he's falling asleep. That's totally normal. By 4 months of age, we start to see some of the emergence of the more typical markers of non-REM sleep architecture, specifically K complexes and sleep spindles. And by around 6 months of age, we're seeing that mature cycling through non-REM sleep with an extended period of deeper sleep at the beginning of the night, then into REM sleep. One of the differences that changes throughout childhood is the length of what's called the ultradian cycle. And that's the length of the average cycle from non-REM through REM. So in an adult, I'd say it's probably 90 minutes. In a young child, it's more like 45 to 60 minutes or even a little bit shorter. So if you look at a hypnogram or a diagram of the stages of sleep at night, the cycling just happens more quickly. Since I'm a clinician, we do a fair amount of sleep studies on young babies, including babies born prematurely in the neonatal ICU. And it actually can be very difficult to ascertain what stage of sleep that they're in. Even the taxonomy of infant sleep is controversial, is not the right word, but it can be challenging to determine if a baby's sleeping or not. And sometimes for really premature babies, we'll actually just look at the simplest taxonomy, which are they lying quietly with their eyes closed? Well, it looks kind of like sleep. And it's just funny. I think some of the challenge is babies actually have really thin skulls. So if you look at their brainwave tracings, they're a lot messier than they are for older children and adults. Yeah. It's interesting, but it's challenging to really assess this.
So I think this is great. So we've got a sense of what sleep need is in this quote unquote newborn phase of 0 to 3 months, 14 to 17 hours, highly polyphasic. Then 4 to 12 months, things come down, 12 to 15 hours, couple of naps during the day, more consolidated sleep at night. But also the knowledge that parents can start to see, look, if my child is a long sleeper at this stage, perhaps relative to my previous child or relative to what someone else is telling me, more than likely that's how it's going to be. That child is going to be a long sleeper, or that child is going to be a short sleeper for a good amount of time. And then the final sort of aspect that I thought was fascinating there is for new parents, especially if this is their first, grunting, leg kicking, weird postural movements, and strange erratic breathing. You could well imagine why you'd be freaking out and saying, oh my goodness, like speed dial the pediatrician. But more than likely, that is going to be REM sleep. So just don't start dialing straight away, would be the take home there. So I think that that's helpful. Maybe what I would love to do now is transition to the thorny topic of sleep training, but not quite getting there yet. Sure. Because
it's like the third rail of pediatric sleep medicine.
Isn't it just, and this is not even my specialty, but I know the incendiary waters that are out there regarding this particular topic. We'll come on to what sleep training is, whether or not you should sleep train, when, if you choose to sleep train, you should sleep train. But help me sort of understand, because when I was reading your book, one of the strongest messages I got is you can glue in place a lot of risk mitigation before you need to even start to think about sleep training, or at least start to enact a bout of sleep training that specific night, all dependent on this thing called the bedtime routine. And I found this to be perhaps one of the most important takeaways for parents. It's a little bit like taking a transatlantic flight that when you're taking off, if you get the trajectory right at takeoff, things will usually go smoothly for the rest of that night of the flight. But if you get the angle off by just a little bit as you're beginning that, you can be at a very unfortunate situation halfway through the flight and a very different place at the end of the flight by just simply very small changes at the beginning of the angle of takeoff trajectory. And it reminded me very much of that if you can get the bedtime routine right, a lot of stuff thereafter seems to just get the right trajectory in place for a more guaranteed, probabilistic, better night of sleep, where sleep training considerations can be de risked a little bit. Would you be able to speak about that? Because I found it so powerful before we get onto the topic of sleep training.
Absolutely. It really is so hard to be a parent, especially of a really young child, a baby. If it's your first child, it's all new. And most of us live in a society very different from the way that humans lived for thousands of years, right? It used to be we lived in these large groups and had lots of people helping us. Most people now are not living particularly close to the grandparents or don't necessarily have help. And if it's your second kid, well, let me tell you, you're going to be imagining your second kid is going to be the same as your first, and they're going to be totally different. I'm saying this based on experience. Um,
Both clinically and
yeah,
personally.
yeah,
I know.
yeah, personally, where my second child was an extreme early riser, and that was not great for us. I think there's a couple of domains for parents to think about. I think that feeding is one where just to sort of think about going forward. In my book, I kind of talked about like the commandments of things you should do in the first couple of months. In feeding in general, you're going to be feeding and soothing your baby to sleep for the first couple of months and do that without a care in the world. At some point in the future, we'll work on changing that. But really, in the beginning, feeding and soothing your baby to sleep is totally appropriate. In fact, they're not going to be able to fall asleep without help. If your child is exclusively breastfed, and I'm very supportive of breastfeeding, I think there's a lot of health benefits to it. Be aware that breastfed babies are going to tend to wake up more frequently and have a longer period of night waking for a couple of different reasons. It seems primarily to be due to the fact that babies digest breast milk more efficiently than they digest formula. And this is probably the mechanism on why breastfeeding is associated with decreased risk of sudden infant death syndrome is that children just don't sleep as deeply. I will say for parents is if you made the choice to breastfeed, that's great. But it's very important that your baby know how to take a bottle. It could be express breast milk, it could be formula. And the reason for this is if you're not a single parent, it is incredibly helpful to have another caregiver in the house who can feed your child, including who can feed your child at night. And I've definitely encountered families that sort of miss this window in the first couple of months. And then they have a child starting daycare at 6 months of age and the child doesn't know how to take a bottle. The reason I'm interested in your child being able to take a bottle, even if you're exclusively breastfed, is later on, if you're having sleep difficulties, having another adult go into the room besides a nursing mom and offering a bottle, it's often just not quite as interesting to the baby as nursing, because nursing is not just the milk, it's also the sensation of closeness and the
Of
mechanism of
course,
it.
yeah.
Sometimes that's a feature and not a bug. It's also important for mom to be able to have someone else spell her. Another thing I've come around to, if I ever do a second edition of the book, I'm going to have to revise it a little bit. Co-sleeping and room sharing. So co-sleeping is kind of an imprecise word. Really, I prefer the terms room sharing versus bed sharing. Bed sharing, it's fairly clear that there is an increased risk of suffocation in the first year of life, especially in the first 6 months. It's one of those things like many parents will bed share with their infant. Does make it easier to breastfeed, but there's just a real risk there of something terrible happening. So the current recommendation is there would be room sharing, but not bed sharing for at least the first 6 months of life. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out very strongly in favor of this in 2016 and in 2022. I believe they reinforce this recommendation. So the idea is if your baby's in your room, you can breastfeed more easily, but it also seems like there may be some reduced risk of SIDS in that context. Although mechanistically, it's not clear to me what it is, and there's some limitations with those studies. The caveat that I would offer to families is that if you find that your baby is sharing a room with you and you are taking your child into bed with you and falling asleep, the risk benefit is probably better for you to move the child out of your room. And the reason being is there's a cohort study of a large group of nurses, and what they found was the families that were room sharing were more likely to end up with unsafe sleep practices like falling asleep on a couch or a chair with an infant. And we know that's tremendously dangerous to babies. So if you find you're sharing a room with your child, you're so sleep deprived, you're accidentally falling asleep with your baby in your bed, you're probably better off having your child sleep in another room if that is available to you.
Yeah, it is somewhat of a controversial issue.
It's a little bit of a boondoggle because I know when this recommendation came out, I was concerned, and I think there's been borne on a little bit that we know the children sleep less soundly instead of the parents with room sharing, but I
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
probably is why it's associated with a reduced SIDS risk.
The other supporter of this podcast is the electrolyte drink company called Element. Now, it's actually 4 letters, LMNT. I am a bit of an exercise fanatic, and I started buying their products some years ago, really, because of two key facts. First is the lack of sugar content. Element has no sugar. It also has no colorings, no artificial ingredients, which is unlike many of the other mixes out there that I was shopping. The second is because of the founders, who have some serious years of biochemistry experience under their belts, and they know what they're doing. So if you want to give it a try, just go to drinklmnt.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 8 free sample packs on any order that you place. Once again, that is drinklmnt.com/Matt Walker. And I think what you've also spoken about regarding bedtime is that the idea of having a routine that perhaps even one parent can always accomplish, emphasis on one, and then obviously all adults wanting to help me understand how parents should see the signs of drowsiness in the evening, which is how should they think about drowsiness as a signal of, oh my goodness, this is the sleep train, it's leaving, we need to jump on it. And then
You,
conversely, when a child wakes up during the night at the first signs of wakefulness, how should you think about parents going into the room? When, on the basis of that? How obsessional should people be about these baby monitors and getting conditioned? Help me pick through that situation of one parent routine, but everyone
sure,
helping, of course, and all of that good stuff.
absolutely. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. Because remember when we were talking before how newborns, they don't really have a lot of wakefulness during the day. And the longest period of wakefulness, even in early infancy, tends to be in the evening, where your baby might be awake for 2 to 3 hours or even 4 hours. And their window for falling asleep could be 2 to 4 hours from the end of that first nap of the day. So it's not that uncommon for newborns to actually be going to sleep at 10 o'clock at night. And a lot of times people talk about this being the witching hour, your kid's just fussing a little bit in the evening. And I definitely experienced this with my older child who was maybe a little bit more on the irritable end of the spectrum. And I just remember carrying him around, he just sort of fussing for an extended period. In terms of reading the signs of sleepiness, they can be subtle. Eye rubbing, almost what we would call in a older patient like a micro sleep, where they sort of like pause for a second in what they're doing, sometimes irritability, but it can be really difficult for parents to capture these windows. And we'll talk a little bit when we talk about sleep training. How do you find the optimal time to put your child down? It isn't always straightforward. One thing you referenced earlier, which I really wanted to bring back, was the importance of a bedtime routine. And this is, I think, a very powerful tool and also an uncontroversial one. We'll talk about why some people are against sleep training or even the issues with the term sleep training, but nobody has a problem with a good bedtime. And many people, myself included, with our first child, we had the most elaborate bedtime. It was both my wife and I bathing our son and like rubbing lotion into him, reading multiple stories and singing together. And it was honestly like it was very sweet, but in retrospect, it was a little bit precious. It would be stressful if somebody wasn't available to help with this. Bear in mind, guys, I had finished my pediatric residency and fellowship. I was experienced in handling and dealing with children, but with it, even then, I was still like sometimes to my wife, I'm like, "Am I doing this okay?" So I'd say for most parents, your routine doesn't have to be complicated, and I think that your bedtime routine is it's all there in the name. It's just a short little ritual that you do every evening before your child goes to sleep. And it's going to change. In early infancy, you're probably going to be feeding or nursing your child to sleep, but still having a few stories. Maybe you like to sing a song. If you have a religious tradition, some people like to do a prayer at that point. It's a signal to your child that's so powerful that we are winding down. And we know even in adult insomnia, it's useful, right, to have these cues. And even though your child needs you to fall asleep in early infancy, building this pattern into your day also is a reminder to parents that this is important. And this is a way for us to demarcate the period of wakefulness and the period of sleep. The reason I stipulate it's important that one parent can do it and that every parent, and if there's a grandparent in the house or somebody else, be available to do this. I don't want to be too heteronormative, but in a lot of heterosexual couples I see, it's always the mom and the dad is like, you holding his hands up and be like, I don't know what to do. And I'd say, do better. You can do this. This is a great thing for you to take on. By 4 to 6 months of age, that's really your window when you might actually be able to put your child to sleep. Here are the magical words: drowsy but awake. That is the window where your child has potentially developed the capacity to self soothe. And that if you put your child down before he or she falls asleep, you may be able to leave the room. Your child may protest a little bit, but it's quite possible that he may fall asleep without further involvement from you. If that happens, that is amazing. If he fusses a ton, he may not be ready for that. And I'd say you could try again in a week or so. We talked about it's so different from child to child.
Well, and it will change almost that quickly from within a week period of time. You can try it again, another 2 weeks. Things could be different.
Absolutely. You don't have to embark on this huge journey of extinction sleep training or something like that. I think as a parent, sometimes it's helpful to think about these things as opposed to live or die decisions. These are little experiments or bets that you do to try to figure out what works. So if you try to put your child down at 8 o'clock and he fusses for 15 minutes and you're like, okay, it's not happening tonight. The stakes are not that high. Give yourself a break. You're figuring it out and your baby's figuring it out too. Matt, you made another really important point too, is once you get past that 3 to 4 months of age, you don't have to race into the room at the first sign of life on the baby monitor. It's almost Pavlovian as a parent. You hear your kid sneeze or make a noise, and my inclination was always to run in and insert the pacifier back into my son's mouth with the idea that I would be somehow averting some sort of catastrophe and I could go back to sleep as quickly as possible. And the fact is you should be attentive to your child's needs, but also it's not an emergency if your child makes a room in the middle of the night. I love technology, but I think that monitoring technology has come a long way since my oldest is 15. We didn't even have a video monitor. Now people are getting these really detailed reports the next day on their child's sleep. I'd say that parents are looking at this data like they're scrutinizing the entrails in ancient Greece to try to figure out what's going on. There's a lot of random noise there. In a nutshell, turn the monitor low. If your kid really needs you, you're going to know, but you don't have to rush in, drop your tea on the floor if you hear a sneeze or something like that.
I love that permission. And I think we're going to come back multiple times throughout these episodes regarding a focus on the parents, because I think one of the things I also took away from your book is perhaps an unfair, undue, myopic attention to the child always, with maybe little compassionate thought of the sleep of the parents, and why, in fact, a well slept parent is maybe the best thing to try and get a well slept child. But we'll get to that. I think this is a fantastic place to draw a close to this episode, because I think we will want to dive in the next episode that will come in this series into the depths of sleep training. But I think the big take home messages here are helping people understand how sleep is going to be in terms of need from that newborn into infancy. We spoke about naps and polyphasic sleep. Then we spoke about bedtime routine and just how critical it is just to glue that in place, and how that's kind of de-risk a good amount of stuff. We spoke about feeding and how so much of that wake sleep schedule is going to be dictated by feeding. Don't freak out about the monitor. Don't race in at the first sign that you may have heard an infant maybe tickle their stomach. That's not the sign of impending disaster. Drowsy but awake. Great tagline. Anything else you want to add before we draw this episode to a close that I've maybe missed here, Craig?
I think it's so important for parents to remember the newborn and infant period can be trying, but it really is such a wonderful and amazing time in your child's life as well. And these changes that come at you so rapidly, developmental changes, changes in sleep, really represent your child's neurological maturation in a really wonderful way. And we'll sometimes see a little sleep disruption with some behavioral milestones, and it may be a little bit frustrating, but also just to think about the amazing fact that you have a child who's born, can do nothing but eat, sleep, and cry. At the end of the first year, you have a child that is walking or maybe crawling, understands a lot of the words that you say, and is really so social, interactive, and curious about the world. A lot of that has to do with their sleep. And Matt, you've talked so much about the power of sleep is something that helps. It's critical for brain functioning.
I think that's part of the reason why, of course, some people get very thoughtful, even concerned as a parent. But it seems as though almost what you're saying is, for the most part, the sleep for the infant will almost take care of itself. I think what's so powerful when you look at the data is that sleep is such a regulated system. And most species, humans included, during that developmental period of time, unless there's something grotesque in the road blocking place, will always find a way to get the sleep that they need. Just relax, don't worry. Developmental perfection is going to happen during sleep at night. There are certainly things that you can do, just as you described, but also don't fret. Well, my dear fellow, I think that's a good place to draw this one to a close. With that, I will thank again my fantastic guest for this and all of the subsequent coming episodes in this series. That is Dr. Craig Canapari, as I mentioned at the start. He is director of the Pediatric Sleep Center at Yale Medical School. Please go and read his book. It's a fantastic book. What I loved about it is that it's not voluminous, because I think Craig deliberately knew that new parents, being so sleep deprived, they don't have almost any time. It's a nice, punchy, short book, unlike my own, which was a tome that you could almost choke a donkey with. Yours is a wonderful, punchy, elegant read. It is called It's Never Too Late to Sleep Train. Go and find it, folks, and you will join me and Craig in the next episode.